He dedicated his life to saving children, until the day he discovered the two he raised weren't his. And the people behind it? His own wife, his own brother. Inside the high-stakes precision of Stanton Medical Center's pediatric cardiac wing, Dr. Graham Voss thrived. Every sound, the beeping monitors, the rhythm of ventilators, the muted commands of a surgical team, was familiar music. Here, in the sterile order of the OR, every move had purpose, every stitch restored a life. Within these walls, the world made sense. He completed the final suture on a delicate heart procedure for a 9-year-old girl. His hands steady even after hours of intense concentration. The assistant beside him offered a quiet compliment. Graham only nodded. He didn't need applause. The successful beat of a heart post-surgery was affirmation enough. Removing his gloves and stepping out of the brightly lit operating room, he checked the time. Well past 7 p.m. He wasn't surprised. His schedule rarely allowed for early nights. Celeste, his wife, understood. At least that's what he had always believed. Her patience with his career was one of the things he once admired most. A message vibrated on his phone. Don't worry about dinner. Taking the twins to Victor's for pizza night. Rest up. It was signed with her usual warmth. But something about it, specifically the mention of Victor, his younger brother, landed differently than before. Victor had always been around. He'd helped out when Graham was buried in conferences or surgeries. The kids adored their Uncle Vic. What once felt like helpful support had lately grown into something else. A pattern of shared dinners, weekend outings, even inside jokes that left Graham oddly excluded. His thoughts were interrupted by a nurse. Ivy Kessler, his mother, had called to say she'd be dropping by the house to help Celeste finalize details for the hospital's annual fundraising gala. She and Celeste had grown unusually close over the past year, almost inseparable. At first, Graham appreciated their bond. But recently, even that comfort began to fray. Conversations stopped abruptly when he entered the room. Eye contact broke. Details were left unspoken. He visited a recovering patient from the previous day's procedure, updated a few files, and made his way home. The lights in the house were low, save for the soft glow from the kitchen window. He assumed his wife and mother were sharing coffee, reviewing gala notes. He entered through the side door that led into his home office, planning to read a few journal articles before bed. As the heating system kicked on with its usual hum, Graham settled into his leather chair, flipping through a dense medical journal. It was a calming ritual, until faint voices filtered through the floor vent, words not meant for his ears. "He's been asking about the kids' eye color again," came Ivy's voice. Controlled, anxious. "I told him what we always say," Celeste replied, "that someone in your family had blue eyes. But Ivy, he's a surgeon. He knows how genetics work." A clink of porcelain followed. Then came a pause. "He can never know," Ivy said at last, "that the twins aren't his, that they're Victor's. It would ruin him." The journal slipped from Graham's hands, landing on the desk with a dull thud. His body remained still, but inside, something ruptured. Years of professional composure tried to assert themselves, but the words echoed with surgical precision, slicing through denial. His wife and his own mother, his brother, they had hidden this from him for 15 years. The children he had raised, loved, and protected, possibly not his at all. He remained in his office for nearly an hour, listening, absorbing, reconstructing timelines. More details followed, Celeste recalling holiday trips to Victor's cabin, Ivy commenting on how much Clara and Deacon resembled Victor now that they were older. It wasn't just betrayal, it was calculation. By the time their voices faded, Graham had entered a different mode. His body moved with mechanical efficiency, gathering his thoughts with the same focus he'd once used to respond to medical emergencies. He didn't rage. He documented. He rose early the next morning, executing his routine with unnatural precision. He greeted Celeste with a kiss, ruffled the kids' hair, waved as they left for school.
No hesitation. No outburst.
Just notes filed away for what was to come. Instead of his usual rounds, he spent the morning making 2 critical phone calls. The first was to Everett Kane, his attorney. The second to a private investigative firm used in high-profile malpractice cases. Graham wanted records. 15 years' worth, if possible, travel logs, financial transactions, phone records. And then he waited. For the next several weeks, Graham Voss became a shadow in his own home. He moved through his days with the kind of practiced stillness that surgeons relied on during the most delicate operations. From the outside, nothing had changed. He performed surgeries with his usual brilliance, exchanged polite words with colleagues, maintained the warm fatherly demeanor his children had always known. But beneath the surface, a storm churned. The private investigator delivered his first round of data within days. Credit card logs, cabin rental receipts, message logs. The patterns were undeniable. Charges for a discreet in near Victor's mountain property appeared regularly, year after year, always timed to align with Graham's out-of-town medical conferences. The phone records painted a more subtle but equally damning picture. Contact between Celeste and Victor spiked sharply whenever Graham was away. The photos were hardest to look at. A camera installed discreetly outside the cabin captured affectionate gestures. Hands brushing, gazes lingering, laughter that didn't belong to a family dynamic. All dated, all detailed, all lined up with the timeline Graham had quietly begun to construct. The betrayal had not been a lapse. It had been a structure, well-crafted, consistently maintained, supported by silence from everyone who should have spoken. Still, Graham didn't confront them. He documented, quietly, methodically. He began recording conversations in the kitchen, scanning emails, reviewing travel history. He observed every family interaction through a new lens. He started to see what had been in front of him all along. How Clara's musical skill mirrored Victor's. How Deacon's sharp sense of humor, once thought to be inherited from Ivy, aligned more with Victor's charm than Graham's steady seriousness. One evening, while organizing evidence in his office, a knock startled him. Clara stood in the doorway, school books in hand, asking for help with her biology homework. Genetics, she said. Punnett squares, eye color, inheritance. It took everything in him to remain composed. He gestured for her to sit beside him and listened as she explained the problem. She couldn't understand how two brown-eyed parents could have two blue-eyed children. Her voice carried innocent confusion, a desire to learn. Graham's explanation was calm, accurate, sterile. Yes, it's rare. Yes, traits can skip generations. Yes, it's still technically possible. But even as he spoke the words, the lie coated his tongue with bitterness. She smiled, satisfied with the explanation. He returned it with effort. Later that night, Celeste spoke on the phone from their bedroom. Her voice soft, affectionate. Mention of Victor's cabin, of Graham's upcoming conference in Denver, of how he never suspected. Her laughter no longer cut through him like it had that first night. It simply confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't a passing affair. It was a second life built inside his own. He spent that evening making arrangements, quiet ones, a temporary lease on a furnished apartment across the country, a new bank account with no digital ties to their current finances, a transfer request for a trauma surgery position at Westbridge Memorial, a facility known for handling high-intensity emergency cases, a place where no one knew his name or his past. 2 weeks later, Graham performed one final surgery at Stanton Medical. It was a complex pediatric case, and as always, he performed flawlessly. The child survived. The parents wept with gratitude. Colleagues clapped him on the shoulder and praised his talent. That night, he left without ceremony.
No warnings. No goodbyes.
He placed a sealed envelope on his desk. Inside, DNA test results, phone records, photographic evidence, transcripts of recorded conversations. No letter.
No lie.
Just truth packaged like a discharge report, ready to be read by those who needed it most. He walked through the quiet house once more. He passed Clara's violin in the hallway, Deacon's soccer jersey draped over a chair. He didn't touch anything. He didn't take anything. Not even a photo. The truth, he believed, was enough to carry with him. As he drove through the sleeping city, his phone buzzed with a message from Celeste. She was heading to the cabin again with the twins. She wished him luck at the conference. Signed it with love. Graham didn't reply. He deleted the message, turned off the phone, and focused on the road ahead. In medicine, he knew that sometimes healing could only begin after the diseased tissue was fully removed. And that's what he'd done. Cut himself free, clean, and silent. The rest he would face alone. 6 years passed like chapters Graham Voss never expected to write. At Westbridge Memorial, he became known for his relentless focus and surgical brilliance. Trauma surgery suited him. It demanded full attention, leaving no space for distractions, no room for past regrets. Each procedure was a clean slate, each emergency a chance to create order out of chaos. No one in Seattle knew about the life he'd left behind on the East Coast. No one asked why he worked every holiday or why he kept personal photos off his desk. They respected his boundaries, and he gave them excellence in return. Meanwhile, his former life carried on without him. Through carefully encrypted channels, his attorney Everett Kane sent him monthly updates on finances, property, and the family he had abandoned by design. Graham never read the reports immediately. He waited until his apartment was quiet, the city beyond the windows stilled by nightfall. Then he reviewed every word. Victor Dane had moved into the house less than 3 months after Graham's disappearance. Celeste told neighbors that she and Victor had grown close in the wake of tragedy. She wore grief like a well-tailored coat, functional, convincing, and designed to soften suspicion. Ivy Kessler held her place at Celeste's side, still the quiet orchestrator behind so many of their choices. The twins, Clara and Deacon, had each processed their father's absence in their own way. Clara buried herself in academics, eventually pursuing pre-med. Deacon became introspective, drawn to psychology. They were driven, but there was something unsettled behind their successes, something restless in their eyes in the photos Graham received. By the time they turned 21, the trust fund Graham had left for them required activation. The clause he'd built in, release at 25 or earlier by his consent, became a quiet trigger. They wanted access, and for that they would have to face him. When they arrived at Westbridge Memorial unannounced, Graham was reviewing post-operative notes in his office. The knock on the door was firm, confident. The faces that greeted him were both familiar and foreign. Clara had grown into her sharp features. Deacon carried Victor's build and posture. But their eyes, they held the same storm Graham had once stared into in the mirror. They entered the room with cautious purpose, as if uncertain whether they belonged there at all. Graham remained seated, calm, motionless. His years in trauma surgery had honed his instincts. He could read fear in a heartbeat, hesitation in a breath. Both were present here alongside something else, a need for truth. Clara spoke first. She explained the reason for their visit, the trust, the conditions, the questions. Deacon added the financial strain of graduate school, but his voice was gentler, less demanding, more curious. Graham didn't answer right away. He opened a drawer instead and pulled out a thick envelope, the one he had updated over the years with precision. Evidence, photos, DNA results, transcripts, documentation as meticulous as a medical record. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he pushed the envelope across the desk. Clara opened it. Her hands trembled as she sifted through each page, each image, each document. Deacon leaned in, his breathing shallow as recognition replaced confusion. The paternity test sat at the top. 2 tests, identical results. Probability of paternity, 0%. Their eyes widened in unison. Years of assumptions shattered in a single breath. Deacon spoke first, not with anger, but with disbelief. He wanted to understand. Why had their father walked away? Why hadn't he confronted them? Graham answered as he had once trained interns in surgery, calmly, with focus. Because some truths, he explained, cut too deep to confront without destroying everything. Because their mother, Victor, and Ivy had chosen deception over disclosure. And because he had chosen not to burn the house down in order to rebuild something of his own. Clara moved next. Her logic, sharpened by scientific training, led her straight to the math. The odds, the blue eyes, the holidays spent at the cabin. The phone records, the dates, everything fell into place. The final item in the envelope was an audio file, recorded years ago without their knowledge. Ivy's voice, clear and controlled, delivered the line that confirmed everything. He can never know the twins are victors. It would destroy him. Graham watched the weight of betrayal settle over them like anesthesia before a difficult procedure. There was no rage, only stunned silence. Eventually, Clara placed the papers back into the envelope, one by one. She asked no more questions. She didn't need to. Deacon looked out the window, his expression distant. Graham said only one more thing: that the trust fund remained available, but that he hoped they now understood why those conditions had been put in place. Truth, after all, wasn't something that could be passed down, it had to be claimed. When they left, Graham didn't follow them to the door. He simply turned back to his charts and continued with his work. There would be more questions in the future. There would be grief, but there would also be clarity. And sometimes that was the first step toward healing. After Clara and Deacon left his office in Seattle, Graham Voss remained still for a long time. Outside, the soft rain of the Pacific Northwest tapped against the windows of Westbridge Memorial, steady and measured, like a heartbeat in recovery. Inside, he turned his chair back toward the charts on his desk, but his eyes didn't read. The moment he'd prepared for during 6 long years had arrived and passed. The truth was no longer a file kept under lock. It had been spoken, absorbed, and now it would begin to echo through every corner of the lives he'd left behind. He didn't need to imagine how the fallout would unfold. Everett Kane, his attorney, kept him informed. Clara and Deacon had returned to Stanton City, their minds clouded with the weight of revelations. They didn't go home immediately. Instead, they visited the cabin that had once been a place of warm memories. Now it stood like a monument to betrayal. Boxes of old photo albums were scattered throughout the storage room. Images of holidays, birthdays, family dinners. And always Victor Dane present, his hand resting lightly on Celeste Ward's shoulder. Always too close, too comfortable. Clara found one particular album that chronicled nearly a decade of Christmases. In most of them, Graham was absent, always on call, always working. It had once seemed noble, the sacrifice of a dedicated surgeon. But now it read like a carefully designed void, one orchestrated by those who knew he would never question a shift in the emergency wing. Deacon noticed the way Ivy Kessler avoided eye contact during their next family dinner. Her voice, once so firm and confident, faltered as she offered to pour more wine. The twins said little. Their presence was deliberate, observational. Ivy knew. She could see it in their posture, hear it in the pauses between words. The silence had changed. A few days later, Clara laid the documents Graham had given her on the kitchen table in front of her mother. Celeste read the contents slowly, her expression changing only slightly as she moved from page to page. There were no denials, no gasps, only silence. Deacon stood behind her, watching not just her reaction, but her resolve. She had rehearsed for this. The narrative she presented afterward was measured, filled with half-justifications and phrases designed to mitigate blame. We didn't want to hurt anyone. It was complicated. Your father was never around. But none of it could soften the clarity of genetic proof, nor the years of deception, nor the audios. The unraveling began there, not explosive, but persistent. Threads pulled loose one by one. Victor tried to maintain composure, even joked nervously during the confrontation. But when faced with the weight of what had been uncovered, his facade cracked. The charm that had once masked his manipulation now seemed shallow, defensive. His confidence was no longer appealing, but transparent. The trust fund remained untouched. Clara and Deacon, now fully aware of its origins and the conditions tied to it, chose to continue funding their education through other means. Clara threw herself into her medical studies with renewed drive. She was no longer following in Graham's footsteps as a father, but rather seeking to match his discipline as a surgeon. Deacon's path in psychology deepened. The betrayal had not broken him, it had clarified his purpose. He began working with patients navigating familial fractures, trauma rooted in lies, and identities shaken by secrets. Back in Stanton City, the image of Celeste and Victor as a grieving widow and supportive brother-in-law began to corrode. Those who had once praised their resilience now whispered behind closed doors. Old friends distanced themselves. Even Ivy Kessler withdrew from public functions, her confidence drained by shame. Their marriage, built on concealment, couldn't withstand daylight. The quiet resentment between Celeste and Victor grew louder. Trust, once held by secrecy, shattered in exposure. Fights broke out about the past, about public perception, about money. They drifted apart like strangers who no longer shared a mission. Within a year, the marriage dissolved. No court drama, no bitterness spilled across social media, just the soundless erosion of something never meant to endure. Meanwhile, Graham remained exactly where he had chosen to be: operating rooms, trauma units, sterile clarity. His connection with Clara and Deacon wasn't forced. He offered no demands. He extended no expectations. But they reached out again. Slowly, conversations began by phone, then video. Then one day, a quiet knock at his apartment door in Seattle. Clara visiting for a surgical conference. Deacon attending a seminar on trauma therapy. They sat around his kitchen table with tea instead of arguments.
No speeches. No reason.
Just the slow building of something real. Trust, Graham understood, was like healing tissue. Fragile at first, but if supported properly, it would hold. 5 years had passed since Graham Voss walked away from his old life without looking back. At Westbridge Memorial, he had become more than a respected trauma surgeon. He had become a standard. His techniques were taught, his decisions analyzed, his precision admired. But beyond the OR, he remained a mystery. Colleagues speculated about the past he never spoke of, but none dared ask. His quiet intensity discouraged curiosity. In Stanton City, the truth had long since completed its slow demolition. What once stood as a carefully maintained illusion had collapsed into scattered ruins of lost trust. Celeste Ward and Victor Dane were now two names that sparked discomfort in polite conversations. Their reputations dulled by years of whispers and quiet exits. Their marriage had ended after barely 2 years. The passion that once seemed worth any price had turned brittle when held under the weight of consequence. Ivy Kessler had moved away quietly, seeking redemption that never quite came. Her attempts to explain herself, to claim she had only wanted to protect her son, rang hollow. The twins sent holiday cards out of obligation, nothing more. Clara and Deacon had found their peace, but not through reconciliation with those who had failed them. Clara had become the youngest attending pediatric cardiologist at Stanton Medical Center, the very place where her supposed father once operated. Her hands were steady, her tone firm, her expectations for honesty non-negotiable. She didn't wear her history, she channeled it. Each successful surgery was less about redemption and more about clarity. The future didn't have to resemble the past. Deacon built a thriving practice focused on family trauma. He never used his own story for marketing, but those who came to him sensed an empathy they couldn't explain. He had lived what many of them feared, betrayal by those closest, and had emerged not untouched, but stronger. Though they lived on opposite coasts, both Clara and Deacon maintained contact with Graham. Not constant, not obligatory. Intentional. Purposeful. It began with shared emails, medical updates, thoughtful reflections. Then occasional visits. Eventually, Clara began spending holidays in Seattle. Deacon joined when his schedule allowed, his partner and their young daughter in tow. It was a relationship built not on assumed roles, but on earned trust. At Westbridge Memorial's annual ethics symposium, Graham stood at the back of a crowded conference room as Clara delivered the keynote. Her voice was calm, certain, an echo of his own when he used to speak to residents. She spoke about integrity in pediatric surgery, about the necessity of transparency with families, about the damage caused by withholding truth for their own good. Graham listened not as a surgeon, but as a man who had once been forced to choose between confrontation and quiet departure. She never mentioned her personal life. She didn't need to. Everyone who mattered already knew what shaped her ethics. After the event, they shared dinner, just the two of them. No speeches, no ceremony. Graham congratulated her. Clara smiled, not with the distance of a student receiving praise, but with the connection of someone who had finally grown into her own legacy. In a quiet moment over dessert, she asked the question he had known would come. "Do you regret not fighting harder back then?" He considered his answer carefully, like calculating dosage before a high-risk surgery. "I don't regret walking away," he said. "I regret what led me to that choice." She nodded, accepting the answer not as judgment, but as fact. Meanwhile, Deacon had built something quieter but just as enduring. His daughter, now 3, his life centered around simple things. Listening, guiding, showing up. He had created the kind of fatherhood that couldn't be faked in photographs or explained through genetics. His daughter didn't know the full story. One day she might, but when that time came, she would learn it from someone who had lived through its lessons and chose not to repeat them. The trust fund remained untouched by either sibling. Not because they rejected it, but because they had learned that some inheritances aren't worth accepting. They had built lives on their own merit. The fund was still there, maintained by Everett Kane, a quiet testament to Graham's foresight and restraint. One late evening, Graham placed a new photo on the bookshelf in his Seattle apartment. It wasn't a family portrait in the traditional sense, just a candid snapshot. Clara at the hospital, Deacon holding his daughter, Graham somewhere in the middle, not posed, just present. He looked at the photo for a long time before turning off the light. The past hadn't been erased. The wounds hadn't disappeared, but they had healed, not through forgiveness, but through truth, ownership, and the refusal to let deception define the future. Some scars stay, but they remind us where the incisions were made and how we survived.